Shortly after graduating from law school, I found myself starting my legal career in a small boutique firm that catered to large self-insured retailers. My work involved a great deal of defense work in the area of premises liability, which is a fancy way of saying I defended stores in slip and fall cases. Not particularly exciting work, but there was a lot of it, and you did get to meet a lot of people. Maybe not the best people, but a lot of them. One afternoon, years later, I arrived at the office of the attorney representing a plaintiff who was suing my client. The office was actually a repurposed old residence on the outskirts of the city. I am told that it was at one time common for people of means to purchase homes outside the city. During the cooler months of the year, they would live in the city, but in the summer, they would move out to the suburbs where it would be more comfortable in the hot months. This converted law office had once been one of these summer homes just outside the city along the banks of the Delaware River. The building was so old, in fact, that it had to be retrofitted and refurbished to allow for electrical lights to replace the old gas lights that it had been built with. They had retained the gas fixtures and swapped out the internals so that electrical lines could be run through them. They used frosted glass bulbs to help create the illusion that they were still gas lights. The effect was really quite remarkable. To add to the antique feel of the building, they installed wood paneling throughout and fitted the whole building with turn-of-the-century era furniture. I'm sure most, if not all, of the furniture were simply modern reproductions, but they still added to the old-time feel of the house. I was so taken by the look and the feel of the house that I failed to notice the time or the fact that the plaintiff was late for the deposition that I had subpoenaed him for. I became agitated and complained to the receptionist that this was simply unacceptable. She, a petite older woman with a very bookish look to her, assured me that the plaintiff would be along shortly. I sat in the parlor and stewed on my own frustrations as I pretended to review the case file I had brought with me. It was a simple slip and fall case, unremarkable from the hundreds I had handled during my career. The plaintiff had come to one of my client's stores and managed to slip and fall in a puddle of clothing detergent in the one corner of the store that was not covered by closed-circuit television cameras. I had been reviewing the file into the late hours of the night before. The plaintiff's medicals were extensive, but really nothing out of the ordinary. A degenerative condition exacerbated by the current incident. He had previously been symptom-free, but as a result of this incident, he was suffering from severe pain and disability on a daily basis. It was all bullshit. The guy had a chronic condition, probably because he did not take very good care of himself. Went to the store, slipped and fell, probably on purpose, and now he's blaming all of his pain on the fall. I knew, as did the plaintiff and his attorney, that cases like these would come down to a battle of experts, mine versus theirs. The question would be whether or not the plaintiff's current complaints were due to his pre-existing condition or the new injury, provided there was any real injury at all. Unfortunately, because it would come down to a question of fact, most defendants will push to settle cheaply rather than take their chance in court. Everything I did in the case, discovery, motion practice, and the like, was really nothing more than posturing. My client would settle, and most attorneys knew it. The only question was when and how much. Mr. Swinton, Mr. Woodrow is ready for you now. The receptionist escorted me into the study where the deposition would take place. This room, like the rest of the house, was marvelous, full of wood and earth-toned appointments. The same gaslight fixtures and antique furniture. The walls in there were lined with warm wood bookcases filled with law books. These too were simply more decoration, adding to the feel of the house. No one uses law books anymore, not in the age of computer-based research tools. But the books did look nice. The room itself was oval in shape, with the long ends being the wall I came in and the bay window on the far side of the room, overlooking the river outside. It was late autumn, so most of the trees were bare, the sky was overcast, and the water in the river was murky, but it was still a pleasant view. Already seated at the table to my left was the other attorney. "Hello, Mr. Woodrow." I stretched my arm across the small oval table to shake his hand, taking him by surprise. He was an older man. Most of the attorneys I faced were, and he was a little embarrassed by my gesture. He awkwardly tried to stand and reached out for my hand at the same time. "Is your client still not here?" I asked as I glanced around the room as if his client was hiding somewhere in the room with us, waiting to be revealed. "Hello, Mr. Swinton." He grasped my hand firmly and pointed to the seat across from his own. As I settled down into the seat he had offered, he continued, "My client is parking now and should be here momentarily. Would you like something to drink? A water? Coffee? Tea?" "No, thank you." I nodded a quiet greeting to the stenographer, who was sitting quietly by the bay window. She returned my nod and quietly switched on her machine. Mr. Woodrow waved off his receptionist, who was still standing in the doorway. She turned and left, pulling the door closed behind her. I apologized for his lateness. His injuries have really had a significant impact on his mobility. He was recently referred to a psychiatrist for depression. I rummaged through my papers to see if I had received previous notice of this alleged depression. I did not recall seeing it in the file last night. Before I could respond, the door opened again. Standing in the doorway was a mountain of a man, much taller than myself and twice as wide. Note, I said wide as opposed to broad. If I said broad, you might have the impression that this man was muscular. I say wide because he clearly was not muscular or even fit. He was orca fat. Orca fat and dirty. Not like the "I've been working all day" kind of dirty, but rather the "I have not gotten my fat lazy ass off the couch in days and came without bathing anyway" kind of dirty. He was wearing a dirty, perhaps once white undershirt, filthy earth-colored, and by earth-colored I mean dirty, sweatpants, and perhaps ironically, work-style boots. His hair was dirty blonde, longish and wavy. His face was pudgy, young, and covered by the wisps of a beard that he was clearly too immature to grow. Truth be told, they really just made him look all the dirtier. "Here is my client," Mr. Woodrow explained. "Great, let's get started." His client sat down in the chair closest to the door. I silently wondered if he chose that chair because any greater trek into the room would have winded him. The poor chair groaned under his tremendous weight as he sat down. The receptionist was standing in the corridor outside the doorway. She reached into the room and pulled the door closed behind her. The look on her face indicated that the plaintiff smelled just as good as he looked. I found my outline of questions and motioned to the stenographer to let her know we would begin. The deposition was not all that different from the hundreds I had conducted before. Simple slip and fall in a discount department store. The plaintiff claimed he stepped in a puddle of laundry detergent that he did not see. His legs slid out from under him, and he landed hard on his rear end. I mentioned to him that the incident report that was created by the store indicated that by the time the store employees came on scene, he was already standing. "Yeah, my friend helped me up," the plaintiff explained. "That was James, right?" "Yep." "He accompanied you to the store that day?" The plaintiff nodded his head in the affirmative in response to my question. "Sir, I must remind you again that this proceeding is being recorded by the stenographer sitting by the window. She is taking down everything we say here today. However, she is only able to record what we say and not what we are doing. So I need you to respond to my questions verbally. Does that make sense?" I was getting frustrated with the plaintiff. This was the third time I had to remind him to respond verbally. I felt like he was doing this on purpose. "Sure." I started again. "So James helped you up?" "Yes." His story was getting worse and worse. "Tell me about James again, please." "Well, what do you want to know?" "How do you know him? How old is he? His approximate height and weight, if you know." "I don't know. I knowed him since we was in kindergarten. He's my age, like 19 and over 6 feet tall." "And how much does he weigh approximately, please?" "I don't know, like maybe 120 pounds soaking wet." 120 at 6 feet plus. That would make him pretty slim, huh?" "Yeah, he's pretty skinny," the plaintiff chuckled to himself. "I'm sorry. You mentioned before, how tall are you and how much do you weigh?" Oh, me? I'm 6'6" and weigh like 475. I paused for a moment to consider his story. That nearly 500-pound man was claiming to have fallen and suffered grievous, life-changing injuries, but his stick-figure friend was able to help him to his feet pretty quickly. While I pondered the physics of what he had just shared, I glanced to the floor and caught sight of his work boots again. I noticed that they appeared untied. The boots were properly laced up, but there was no knot in the laces. The free ends appeared to be tucked back into the boots. "Sir, I just noticed that your shoes today are untied." "Uh-huh." I clenched my teeth to avoid saying something I would regret later. "I'm sorry. Was that a yes?" "Yep." "If I could ask you to think back to the day of the incident, do you think you could recall whether or not you were wearing these or similar shoes on that day?" "Same ones." "Were they tied?" "Nope." "I'm sorry, sir. You responded pretty quickly. Did you want to think about that answer? I only ask because if you had asked me what I had for breakfast today, I would need to think about it for a few minutes. If you asked me what I did 2 years ago, it would take me even longer." "The subject incident occurred," I scanned my notes, "about 19 months ago," Mr. Woodrow offered. "Thank you, Mr. Woodrow. 19 months ago. How can you be so sure they were not tied on the day of the incident?" "Never tie 'em. Can't reach 'em due to my size. I just slip 'em on and off." I paused for a second and looked at my notes, but I did not read them. Truth was, I was taking a moment. I needed to process what he said. He could not even reach his feet to put his shoes on. Glancing at my notes, I saw where I had written his age. He was 19 years old. "Okay, let's talk about your work experience." "Okay, that's an easy one." "I'm sorry, why do you say that?" "Oh, 'cause I don't have any." "Excuse me, are you saying you have never worked before?" "That's right, I've been on assistance since I turned 18. "How is that possible?" "When I was turning 18, I went down south with my ma to visit some family in North Carolina. We have some kin down there. My uncle took one look at me and said, 'Son, you should be on disability.' So once I turned 18, I applied." I was thoroughly disgusted at this point. I am not one who can easily hide my emotions. I looked up at him, and I stared at him for a moment in disbelief. This man was, as far as I could tell, the very personification of everything I detested in a human being. A consumer who would never contribute anything to society or to anyone else besides himself. The only thing that he could ever produce was more burden on those around him. While he sat on his rump indulging himself, he left the rest of us to support him. My momentary lapse was interrupted by a loud chirping sound. It sounded like a cricket or a grasshopper chirping in the room. I looked at Mr. Woodrow to see if he had heard it too. He was looking to his client, who was digging into his filthy waistband of his overburdened sweatpants with his greasy, chubby fingers. After a few seconds of digging around in the dirty rolls of his bloated flesh beneath his waistband, he pulled out a cell phone.